Dred Scott and Lincoln's Response, Lecture 1. In this lecture, I'm going to talk primarily about Dred Scott v. Sandford, the 1857 Supreme Court decision authored by Chief Justice Roger Taney. It's spelled so you'd think it'd be pronounced Taney, but it is in fact pronounced Taney. This is perhaps the most infamous Supreme Court decision in the history of the court, and is certainly one of the precipitating factors of the Civil War, coming as it did only roughly 3.5 or 4 years before the Civil War began. Now, the case itself and even the facts behind the case are actually rather complicated, and I'm not going to go through all that. There are just a few kind of big things that I want you to take away from Dred Scott v. Sandford. Now, the reason why it was such an inflammatory case at the time is that the upshot, the main decision of the case was that African Americans cannot be citizens of the United States. This decision was welcomed by the pro-slavery parts of the country, and especially in those areas where there was strong anti-slavery sentiment. Not only was the decision rejected, but it actually, for probably a generation or so, really harmed the reputation of the Supreme Court. Now, the facts behind the case, to oversimplify, but just to give the basic account, was that Dred Scott was a slave. He and his family were brought to live for many years in the free states or territories. So in other words, he was taken by his master. There were actually a couple different masters, but we won't get into that. He was taken into territories where slavery was not allowed. And then he was brought back, and he sued in federal court for his freedom. And he argued that by virtue of being brought to a free territory where slavery was illegal, his master had in effect emancipated him, that in taking him into a free territory, he had made Dred Scott and his family into a free man. Now, those facts are laid out on page 145 of your packet. And the decision, the Dred Scott decision, declared or at least implied three things. Again, one, the big decision: slaves and their descendants, whether enslaved or free, can never be citizens of the United States of America. So African American slaves. The second conclusion, which is where he invalidates the Missouri Compromise, is his conclusion that the federal government has no right to ban slavery in the federal territories. Remember that as the United States expanded, there were territories that were under the control of Congress, that Congress would make the codes for. And then these territories, they would organize territorial legislatures. So, for example, I have a great-great-great-grandfather who was in the Oregon territorial legislature. And so even with the territorial legislatures, it was still the case that the territories were under the jurisdiction of Congress until they, wrote their own constitution and joined the Union as states. And, excuse me, throughout the history of the country, even before the Constitution, under the Northwest Ordinance, one of the things that Congress had done was to ban the practice of slavery in some of the territories. In the Dred Scott case, Chief Justice Taney rejected the notion that Congress actually had the authority to ban the taking of slaves into the territories. And that's why, even though the Missouri Compromise was no longer in force since the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, he sort of retroactively invalidates it. So that's the second thing that the decision did. The third thing, and this is one that was an implication rather than a declaration, is that the reasoning that Taney used to argue that the federal government could not ban slavery in the territories, a lot of people looked at that reasoning and thought that a very similar reasoning could be used to argue that state governments do not have the authority to prohibit people from bringing slaves into those states. So, for example, Massachusetts, the implication would be something like that if a slave owner from Mississippi wanted to bring slaves to Massachusetts, that Massachusetts would not, in fact, have the right to prohibit him from doing so. Tawney didn't say that, but that was the implication. And therefore, for a lot of people, the Dred Scott decision was extremely worrying because they were afraid that the Supreme Court was just sort of setting itself up for another case where they would declare that slavery can't be banned anywhere in the country. And thus they saw the Supreme Court as being used as a tool by the slave-owning interests to spread the institution of slavery throughout the country, which was a very alarming implication for a lot of people. Now, the actual argument, the part of the decision that I had you read, the argument is fairly straightforward. So remember the facts. So Dred Scott was taken by his owner into free territories. Was he thereby emancipated, or did he remain a slave? Since he was suing in federal court, the first decision or the first question that the court had to take up was, is Dred Scott an American citizen, a U.S. citizen, such that he can actually sue in federal court, right? Because federal courts, for the most part, you have to be a citizen in order to have standing in federal court to sue another citizen. So was Dred Scott a citizen? Now, the reasoning here is a little strange. That this is on pages 145 and 146. It basically, what he says is any person or class of person who was a citizen in the states at the time that the Constitution was adopted, thereby also became a citizen of the United States. As he says, in discussing this question, we must not confound the rights of citizenship which a state may confer within its own limits and the rights of citizenship as a member of the Union. It does not by any means follow, because he has all the rights and privileges of a citizen of a state, that he must be a citizen of the United States. And so since the federal courts are for the citizens of the United States, the question becomes, okay, well, who is qualified to be a citizen of the United States? It says, it is true, every person and every class and description of persons who were at the time of the adoption of the Constitution recognized as citizens in the several states became also citizens of this new political body, the Union, but none other. It was formed by them and for them and their posterity, and for no one else. It says it becomes necessary, therefore, to determine who were citizens of the several states when the Constitution was adopted. So, in other words, the way that he frames it is to say, well, in order to see whether Dred Scott is a citizen or could be a citizen of the United States, we have to see whether African Americans were citizens of the United States at the time of the founding. And what he argues, his controversial claim on page 146, is that neither slaves nor their descendants, even free ones, were part of the people of the United States at the time that the Constitution was adopted. African Americans were not part of we the people, and therefore they could not become members of we the people. As he says on page 146, in the opinion of the court, the legislation and history of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves, nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. So that's a big claim. It's also, I think, pretty easily shown to be a false claim, as the dissenting opinion in Dred Scott itself pointed out that there were 5 states at the time that the Constitution was adopted that had free voting African American citizens in them. So there were, in fact, states where free African Americans were citizens, which would imply that therefore they could be part of we the people. And honestly, I have no idea how or whether Tawney ever responded to that, because that seems to blow up his entire argument, but I don't know what he said. But instead, what Tawney argues is no, they were not considered to be part of we the people, and to see that we have to go back and enter into the opinions of the time. As he says, it is difficult at this day to realize the state of public opinion in relation to that unfortunate race, African Americans, which prevailed in the civilized and enlightened portions of the world at the time of the Declaration of Independence and when the Constitution of the United States was framed and adopted. So he goes on to say, they had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. This opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well as in politics, which no one thought of disputing or supposed to be open to dispute. End quote. So that's a very serious claim, right? Now, I would say that to a large extent, I think that was quite true prior to the Revolutionary period. But you should remember the evidence from West's chapter on slavery and the founding to show that, in fact, the notion that African Americans had no rights whatsoever and could be justly enslaved, that was certainly an opinion that came to be questioned during the Revolutionary period and, in fact, rejected by many leading Americans. So he tries to base this argument on a very questionable empirical claim, namely that the inferiority of African Americans to whites was so universally held by whites that no white Americans at the time of the founding considered it a possibility that African Americans could have equal rights of any kind. Now, what's interesting is Tawney does confront what is probably the biggest piece of counter evidence, namely, what about the Declaration of Independence, right? Doesn't the Declaration of Independence say all men are created equal? Jefferson wrote it. Lots of people signed that. So if it really was the case that that whites did not believe in equality, why would there be this Declaration of Independence, which seems to say that they do? Now, Tawney recognizes that he has to confront this, and he offers an interpretation of the Declaration of Independence that has been accepted both by many different people since then as the correct interpretation of the Declaration, even though I don't think it actually is. But the way he puts it, when he brings this up, this is on page 146, he says, the language of the Declaration of Independence is equally conclusive. As he says, it proceeds to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Right. So he points to what would be Exhibit A for anybody who argued that, in fact, the founders do believe in natural equality. And he admits, he says, the general words above quoted would seem to embrace the whole human family, and if they were used in a similar instrument at this day, would be so understood. So in other words, if somebody in 1857 says all men are created equal, everybody listening to that person would understand that person to be including all races, to be truly saying all men, regardless of race, are created equal. But he goes on to say that it is too clear for dispute, this is the top of page 147, it is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. So in other words, he claims that even if in 1857 people would understand all men are created equal to be a universal claim, in 1776 they did not. In 1776, the people who wrote the Declaration, the people who read the Declaration, according to Tawney, read the claim all men are created equal to be saying all white men are created equal. That's his claim. And you sometimes hear this in textbooks or what have you, or somebody will say, well, when Jefferson said all men are created equal, what he really meant was all white men are created equal. I think that's false with regard to Jefferson, but that interpretation of the Declaration, you find it here in the Dred Scott decision. But now, how can Tawney be so confident that that's the right way to interpret it? I mean, wouldn't it have made more sense for them to say all white men are created equal or something like that, if that's really what they meant? And but Tawney says no, they wouldn't need to. As he says, if the language as understood in that day would embrace them, that is, embrace African Americans, the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted, and instead of the sympathy of mankind to which they so confidently appealed, they would have deserved and received universal rebuke and reprobation. In other words, if they had said all men are created equal and actually did mean to include all men, they would have been obvious hypocrites. Because they would have been declaring equality on the one hand with their words and denying it by their deeds on the other. So he says, so they couldn't have meant all men because then they would have been hypocrites. They would have been broadcasting their hypocrisy. Because remember, the Declaration was written for other countries, right, to understand the American cause. And as he goes on to say, but that's the founders were not like this. They were not the kind of people who would assert principles contrary to the ones that they act upon. The founders were not hypocrites. And so in writing all men are created equal, they meant all white men, and they knew everybody would understand them to be saying all white men, because that's the way all civilized and enlightened people thought at the time. So it's an interesting argument, right? So when they say all men, they meant all white men. And the reason why was because, well, look, they owned slaves. They tolerated the practice of slavery. So if they tolerated it, they must not have actually thought it was bad, right? So you interpret the claim all men are created equal in a way that purportedly makes it consistent with their actions, right? They were civilized, they were virtuous, they were patriotic, they were not hypocrites. And so their speeches, their principles, their pronouncements would be in accord with their actions. And since they actually tolerated the institution of slavery, we have to interpret the claim all men are created equal in a way that makes it consistent with the practice of slavery, because the framers were consistent. And what is that? And what's that consistency? All white men are created equal. Because if that's what they believed, then that assertion that all men are created equal becomes compatible with the practice of slavery. Now, all I'll say in conclusion to this lecture is obviously we've already seen a different interpretation. You could believe that all men are created equal and yet tolerate the existence of slavery if you thought that the immediate abolition of slavery would cause more harm than good at the time, right? This was part of what West was trying to show in his chapter, is that in fact, the founders could be anti-slavery but not be abolitionists if they thought that the way that was most consistent with the common good and the preservation of the Union was a process of gradual emancipation. But that possibility is rejected by Tawney. Tawney simply says their speeches and their deeds must match one another. They tolerated the institution of slavery. Therefore, we must interpret all men are created equal in a way that is consistent with the practice of slavery. And the way you do that is by understanding all men to mean all white men. And the next lecture, I'll conclude the Dred Scott decision, and then we'll move on to Lincoln.